The sky broke open like an old promise, the kind whispered in youth, but abandoned in age. Thunder rolled low across the prairie, not in anger, but in sorrow, and the rain that followed fell thick as grief. It soaked into the dry earth and pooled in wagon tracks that led nowhere, ruts carved by a man who left without turning back. Eleanor stood in the downpour, her wedding dress clinging to her bones. The lace was old, yellowed by time, and the hem sagged heavy with mud. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the silence that followed his last words. You should have known this would never work. He had said it without cruelty, just carelessness, like a man kicking dust from his boot. Behind her, the path they traveled had already begun to wash away. Before her, the vast open prairie stretched under iron skies, unforgiving and endless. She was 47, not young, not old, not by her measure, but old enough, apparently, to be deemed a burden when the storms came. He'd left her by the broken wagon wheel just as the first crack of thunder split the sky. Took the horse, the gun, and the canteen. Said he'd ride ahead, find help. But she'd seen the way he looked at her. Not like a man watching his bride suffer, but like someone shedding an obligation. She had seen pity before, at funerals, at church pews after her first husband's death. She had worn it like a second skin in the years since, but it never cut like this. The wind howled through the tall grass, and she lowered herself beside the wagon, arms wrapped around her knees. Her boots were soaked, her stockings torn, and a blister throbbed where the leather had rubbed raw. She pressed her back to the wooden wheel and tilted her head to the sky, letting the rain wash the dust from her face, the paint from her lips, the hope from her eyes. In the distance, lightning crawled across the sky, like cracks in stained glass. She thought of James, her first husband, and the quiet steadiness of his love. He had not promised grand things, only kept small ones. A fire always burning when she came in from the cold. Her tea always steeped just right. He had died with her name on his lips, and for 5 long years after, she had carried the weight of that devotion like a cloak. Then came the letter from out west. A widowed settler looking for a wife. The promise of land. A home. A second beginning. She had sent her reply with trembling hands, packed her belongings in a cedar trunk, and boarded a stage with the breathless hope of a girl much younger. Now she sat alone with a storm for company, and her name lost in the wind. A sharp cry broke through the rain, something between a hawk's screech and a human call. Eleanor turned her head, squinting into the haze. She saw nothing, just shadows, the kind that shift and reshape with every gust. The wagon groaned as the wind pushed against it, and she felt a sharp, splintering ache deep in her chest. She coughed once, twice, her throat raw from hours of shouting into the void. Her limbs ached. Her skin had gone pale beneath the cold. She knew the signs. The chill creeping into her core wasn't just weather, it was danger. She needed shelter. With numb fingers, she pulled herself upright and stumbled into the grass, eyes scanning the land for anything resembling refuge. Trees in the distance. A small rise in the land. There, a hollow beneath a cedar that had split in some long-ago lightning strike. She dragged herself toward it, step by step, boots squelching in the mud, hands clawing through wet grass. Each breath felt like swallowing glass, and by the time she reached the hollow, her dress was torn and her body trembling. The hollow was small, barely enough room to sit curled within, but it was dry, or drier than the open. She sank into it and pulled her shawl around her shoulders, though it offered little warmth. The scent of wet cedar filled her lungs. She leaned her head against the rough bark and closed her eyes. She dreamt, though she didn't mean to. In her dream, a child's hand held hers, small and warm. She looked down, but could not see the face. Just the sensation, the unmistakable tenderness of a hand that trusted hers. She whispered a lullaby, without meaning to. The wind sang it back to her. She woke hours later, or maybe only minutes. Night had fallen, or the storm had thickened. It was hard to tell. Her limbs were heavier now, and her heartbeat was faint in her ears. But something had changed. Footsteps. Not the hurried gait of someone running from a storm, but the quiet, deliberate tread of someone who had always walked with the land. She didn't move, just kept her eyes half closed and breath steady. Then warmth. A blanket, soft, heavy, settled over her shoulders. The scent of smoke and sage filled her nose. A hand touched her forehead, calloused, warm. She flinched, but the hand remained, still and unthreatening. She opened her eyes. The face that met hers was carved from the same stone as the cliffs she'd seen in distance. Strong, lined, calm. Eyes dark as riverbed silt and just as deep. He said nothing, just watched her, then nodded once. Not a question. A promise. He lifted her gently, one arm beneath her knees, the other steady at her back. She didn't resist. Couldn't. Her head lolled against his chest, and she felt the rhythm of his heartbeat. Steady, unshaken. They moved through the dark like ghosts, his steps silent over mud and root. The storm softened around them, as if unwilling to disturb the quiet he carried. Ahead, a faint glow flickered, orange against the darkness. A fire. He set her down beside it, wrapped the blanket tighter, and stirred the embers until flames rose anew. She shivered once, violently, then stilled. He offered her a carved bowl, steam curling from its rim. She took it with shaking hands. The broth tasted of herbs and earth and something wild. It filled her belly with warmth she hadn't known she could feel again. She looked at him, still silent, still watching. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice cracked. He shook his head softly, not in denial, but in patience, as if to say there would be time. Words would come, but breath was more important now. The fire crackled. Rain tapped the shelter's edge. Somewhere in the night, an owl called out. She finished the bowl and held it close to her chest. Her eyes closed again, but this time she did not drift into sleep from cold or despair. This time it was peace. And in that quiet moment, as wind rustled the edges of the world, she realized something small, something true. She had not been rescued. She had been found. And there is a difference. The storm did not end. It simply passed on, as all storms do. But the man stayed. And when Eleanor opened her eyes again, she whispered not his name, for she did not know it, but the name the thunder had spoken when she thought she was alone. Her own. Eleanor. Still here. Still worthy of being seen. The morning rose slowly, casting a pale amber light across the high desert. The air held the scent of damp earth and cedar, and the sky, still bruised from the night storm, wore streaks of silver like old scars. Eleanor awoke with a tight breath in her chest, unsure at first if she was dreaming. The blanket covering her felt too soft to be real, the fire too warm, the shelter too solid. For a moment she lay still, eyes half open, letting her senses gather themselves like scattered beads. The man who had carried her lay a few paces away, cross-legged and quiet, whittling a long piece of wood with a knife that looked like it had seen generations. His face was angled away from her, his expression unreadable but untroubled. He moved slowly, with the patience of stone shaped by wind. Eleanor didn't speak. Something in her understood that silence here wasn't absence. It was reverence. Her body ached, but less than the day before. Her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, drawing it closer. There was a bowl beside her again, this time filled with a mash of cooked root and berries. She touched it gently, as if testing whether the comfort it offered was real. He noticed her movement, but did not turn. Instead, he reached into a leather pouch and drew out another length of wood. He shaped it with the same methodical grace, each stroke of the blade even and measured. Eleanor sat up slowly, careful not to startle the stillness between them. Her dress, though cleaner than she remembered, was still torn at the hem. Someone, him, perhaps, had washed the mud from the fabric and left it to dry near the coals. She touched her hair, felt the damp braid someone had woven while she slept. Her eyes burned without warning. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. He paused, not from surprise, but from recognition. He nodded once, then returned to his carving. She ate, and the food settled warmly inside her, as though it had been made with knowing, not simply for hunger, but for weariness. Her body had known nothing but punishment for days, cold, wet rejection. Now it rested, and for the first time in what felt like years, she did not feel like she owed anyone for the right to breathe. After she finished, she placed the bowl beside her and watched him work. The firelight caught in the curve of his cheekbone, the small flecks of gray near his temple. He was older than she had thought the night before, perhaps in his early 50s, but there was no frailty in him. His silence was not heavy, not guarded. It was a still pool, inviting depth, not fear. She wondered what to call him. To ask seemed forward, but to not know felt stranger. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. A bird chirped in the brush. The wind shifted. He looked up then, finally meeting her eyes. Something passed between them, acknowledgement, perhaps, or memory. He did not offer his own name in return, but his gaze held hers with the steadiness of someone who had always known how to listen. Moments passed like petals falling from a branch, soft, slow, unnoticed until the ground was covered in beauty. Later that day, she was helped, gently, wordlessly, out of the shelter. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and he offered his arm. She took it, not out of weakness, but because he held it not as a rescuer, but as an equal. They walked slowly through a path worn into the land by quiet repetition. The desert opened before them, framed by the towering red cliffs, and patches of wildflowers blooming defiantly between rocks. She'd never seen a land so empty and so alive all at once. In the distance, a small cluster of dwellings stood nestled between the stones and trees, rounded earthen homes with smoke curling from the chimneys and the scent of something baking on the air. A child ran by, laughing, her long black braid flying behind her like a flag. An older woman waved from a stoop, her face creased like weathered bark, but her smile young. The man did not speak, but he led Eleanor gently toward a low shelter of stone and clay, the edges smoothed by time. Inside, the air was rich with sage and wood smoke. Blankets lined the floor. A clay bowl of water waited by the doorway. She sat on a thick rug and folded her hands in her lap, unsure of what was expected. The man disappeared through a beaded curtain and returned with another woman, old, bent, yet strong in presence. Her hair was white and bound with leather string, her eyes sharp with something more than sight. The woman introduced herself as Nellie. Her voice was a whisper and a command all at once. She knelt beside Eleanor, touched her cheek, examined her hands, and murmured something soft in a language Eleanor did not know, but felt. The touch lingered, not invasive, not clinical, but full of knowing. Nellie nodded once, then handed her a carved cup. The tea was bitter and dark, but Eleanor drank it down. For 3 days, the rhythm of silence wove around her. The man, still unnamed, brought her food, water, and wood for the fire. He tended the garden, checked the go pens, carved endlessly. She learned to read the meaning in his quiet, the way his eyes lingered when she smiled, the soft hum he made when the stew was good, the gentleness in how he passed her tools when she offered to help mend baskets. He didn't stare. He didn't speak much, but he noticed everything. One afternoon, she sat beside the fire with a piece of cloth in her lap, trying to stitch the torn hem of her dress. Her fingers fumbled. She'd sewn before, years of mending shirts and curtains, but her hands still trembled from days of cold. He watched her for a moment, then set aside his carving and knelt beside her. Without touching her hand, he adjusted the thread and showed her a knot she didn't know. His fingers moved with care, his breath warm on her wrist. When their hands brushed, she did not pull away. When she looked up, he was already looking back. That night, she stepped outside alone and looked at the sky. Stars blanketed the heavens, more than she had ever seen. She whispered a name to the wind. His, she hoped, but it returned with another. Atza. The next morning, she said it aloud as he entered the room. Just his name, nothing more. He paused, then nodded once, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that might have been true, but because her soul had stopped flinching. Nellie began teaching her to grind herbs. A girl named Cully appeared each morning with questions and berries. Eleanor laughed more than she had in years. It was a laughter that came slow, rising from the bones, unsteady but honest. And still, Atsa remained steady as the horizon, never pushing, never asking, just offering presence. One day, as she poured water into the garden rose, a stranger rode up to the edge of the dwellings. Dust caked his boots and bitterness lined his mouth. It was the settler, the one who'd left her in the storm. He looked surprised to see her alive, more surprised to see her changed. "You still out here?" he muttered, half to himself. "Didn't think the land would keep you." Eleanor didn't answer. She stood, shoulders straight, hands calm. "You look older," he added. "I am," she replied. "And I'm not sorry." Atsa stepped out from the shadows of the garden, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He said nothing, but the settler looked away first. He didn't stay long. As he turned to leave, Eleanor bent to pick another seed for planting. Her fingers were steady now. The earth welcomed her touch. Later that evening, Atsa set a carved figure beside her. A bird in flight, wings stretched wide. "For you," he said. His voice was deeper than she expected, quiet, with the weight of long-held silence. She traced the curves of the carving, her eyes filling, not with sorrow, but something softer. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her, then down at the soil between them. "Because you are not broken," he said. Only resting, she held the carving to her chest, feeling its shape press against her heartbeat. That night, she didn't sleep alone. They sat beside the fire, not touching, not speaking, just breathing the same air. And when the flames fell low, she whispered into the quiet, not expecting an answer, but finding one anyway. "I was afraid no one would ever see me again." Atsu's gaze held hers. "I see you." And in the hush that followed, she believed him. The morning came with no fanfare. No songbirds, no grand sunrise, just the soft breath of wind curling over the earth, carrying the scent of damp cedar and the faint tang of smoke. Eleanor stirred from sleep beneath her woven blanket, eyes blinking open to the golden hush of dawn. She rose slowly, careful not to disturb the warmth that had gathered around her. Outside, Atsa was already tending the morning fire, his movements steady and reverent as always. For weeks now, the rhythm of her life had followed the beat of this land. Sunrise and tending, mending and planting, firelight and silence. But beneath the calm, something had begun to shift. Not in Atsa. He remained solid, like the stone ridges that watched over the village, but in her. In the quiet stretches of day, where his presence lingered nearby, Eleanor had begun to feel something stir inside her chest, soft and unfamiliar. Not longing, not need, but something deeper, a blooming. She joined him by the fire without speaking. Their mornings no longer required words. He handed her a cup of pine tea. She took it, letting her fingers brush his in quiet thanks. The warmth between them was no longer tentative. It had settled in with the season, woven into every shared glance, every moment their hands met over garden tools or stitch seams. There was no rush, no declarations, only the kind of understanding that grows in silence and stays. Today, however, that stillness felt thinner, like paper held too close to a flame. It began with a rider. Dust rose on the southern path just past mid-morning. Cully, always first to spot movement, came running to the edge of the garden, her braid bouncing with urgency. "Someone comes," she called, pointing. "A white man. Loud horse." Eleanor's fingers paused at the edge of a woven basket. A chill licked up her spine. She didn't need to look to know. Her bones already knew who approached. The settler. He came dressed finer than before, his coat clean, boots polished. But his face still held the same shallow pride and smug curl of the lips, as if the world had somehow wronged him by moving on. He dismounted with the swagger of a man who thought the land owed him something. "Well," he said, sweeping his gaze over Eleanor, "you're still alive." She stood rooted in place, not from fear, but from clarity. The woman he'd abandoned in the rain was long gone. This version of her had hands stained with earth, eyes that had seen tenderness in silence, and a soul that no longer bent to those who couldn't see her worth. "I am," she replied simply. Atsa stepped forward, his posture calm, but his presence undeniable. He said nothing, just stood beside her, a mountain made flesh. The settler laughed dryly. So this is what you chose instead? A man with no voice and a patch of dirt. Eleanor didn't flinch. No, she said. This is what chose me. Something in her tone gave him pause, but pride would not let him stay silent. I told the folks in town about you. They said they always figured you were desperate. A widow chasing ghosts. Too old to start fresh. I only did what made sense. You left me to die, she said, voice steady. That was your truth. He shrugged. You seemed strong enough to make it. She took a step closer. You didn't leave because I was old. You left because I reminded you of what you feared. Someone who wouldn't shrink for your comfort. The words settled around them like dust. Atsa moved then. Not quickly, not threatening, but with purpose. He walked past Eleanor, stepped toward the settler, and looked him directly in the eye. No weapon. No raised voice. Just presence. And in that gaze, there was no hatred. Only something deeper. Pity. The settler looked away first. I'll be riding on, he muttered, backing toward his horse. Nothing worth staying for anyway. He mounted, turned, and disappeared into the dust from which he came. A heavy silence followed. But it wasn't fear that hung between them. It was something else, release. That evening, the fire burned low and steady. The sky overhead bled into twilight, stars rising slow over the rim of the canyon. Eleanor sat by the hearth, hands idle for once, her thoughts full. Atsa brought her a bowl of stew and sat beside her. For a long while, they didn't speak. But tonight, the silence begged to be broken. He said I was too old, she whispered, more to the flames than to him. Atsa watched the fire, his voice quiet. Fire does not ask how long the wood has lived. Only whether can still burn. Her throat tightened. I lost something in that storm, she said. Not just the future I thought I wanted. Something older. A voice I used to hear inside myself. Telling me I was still alive. Still worthy. Atsa nodded, gaze never leaving the flames. Storms take. But they also reveal what roots remain. She turned to him then. Do you ever wish to forget? He met her eyes. No. I only wish to remember well. The wind curled around them, lifting the scent of smoke and sage. Eleanor reached for his hand. Not out of fragility, not out of fear, but as a woman who had walked through fire and found herself whole. He laced his fingers through hers. No rush, no claim, just two people choosing the same place, the same moment. A week passed, then another, and with each day, her roots deepened. Children came to her for stories. Naley taught her to sing the old songs in soft tones. Cully braided her hair in new patterns. The land opened itself, and she no longer felt like a guest, but a part of the breath that moved through it. One morning, Atsa left a carved figure by her mat. A wolf carved from ashwood, its eyes shaped like embers. She picked it up with reverence, tracing the grain of the wood. He returned before she could ask why. It is you, he said softly. You survived the winter. You did not run from a cold. She blinked against the sting in her eyes. And you, she asked. I walked alone for many years, he said. But when I found you, I knew the path had not been empty, only waiting. Later that night, under a sky blistered with stars, Eleanor stepped barefoot into the sand outside their home. The cool earth welcomed her steps. Atsa followed, standing beside her in quiet companionship. I used to think love came with thunder, she said, with vows and fevered kisses and promises shouted to the wind. He waited. But now I see it more clearly, she continued. Love is this, your hand when mine is tired, your presence when I am silent, your breath beside mine when the world turns too quickly. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. I do not need to name this to know it, he said. I know, she whispered, but I wanted you to hear it all the same. A coyote howled in the distance, not mournful, but wild and full of life. The fire crackled behind them, casting long shadows across the sand. And there, beneath the canopy of stars, without rings or witnesses or ceremony, Eleanor leaned into Atsa's shoulder and let herself rest. not as someone saved, but as someone seen, cherished, chosen. The past still lived within her. The rain, the abandonment, the silence. But none of it defined her now. The fire had not burned her away. It had revealed what could not be consumed. The seasons turned like a slow breath, and Eleanor began to measure time not in days or months, but in the way the wind changed, how the roots deepened, and how the people she'd come to love began folding her into the rhythm of their lives. Her hair had grown longer, streaked now with silver like river light. The lines near her eyes had softened, not with age, but with belonging. She spent her mornings in the garden, fingers deep in soil, teaching Cully how to coax medicine from herbs. By afternoon, she would sit in the shade of the apricot tree Atza had planted for her, telling stories to the children while the scent of bread wafted from Naley's hearth. In the quietest hours, when the moon watched the land from her perch above the cliffs, Eleanor and Atza would sit shoulder to shoulder, sharing silence as if it were scripture. One morning, Eleanor walked the edge of the canyon alone. A woven basket rested in the crook of her arm, filled with sage, cornflower, and smooth stones she'd gathered along the path. The air was dry and full of light, and the world felt held in a sacred pause. She stopped near the cedar hollow, where her life had been altered by thunder and kindness. The same tree still stood, bark pale and split, roots grasping the earth like ancient fingers. She knelt and placed the stones gently in a circle, a gift of remembrance. As she stood, she felt a presence behind her. No sound, no movement, just a shift in the air that only familiarity brings. Atza. He stood with a carved staff in his hand, something new etched into the grain. He held it out to her. "For you," he said, "to steady what already stands." She took it with a trembling smile, her fingers sliding over the carved patterns, waves, feathers, blossoms. Stories told in wood. Atza's voice came softer than usual, and yet each word held the weight of sky. "There will be a ceremony soon. A wedding. My cousin's daughter. They've asked us to bless the fire." Eleanor looked up, surprised. "Us?" He nodded. "You are one of us now." She turned away for a moment, not to hide her tears, but to offer them to the land. Then she turned back, pressing her forehead gently to his. In that closeness, neither asked for more. There was no proposal, no ring, no swelling of violins. Only the agreement of breath and trust. A vow long since lived. Word of the settler who had once abandoned her never returned. Whether he had gone east or further west, she no longer wondered. The storm he left behind had fed something in her, watered the roots that now held her steady. Spring came dressed in green, wildflowers erupting along the trails. The village prepared for the wedding with a joyful stillness. Songs floated from windows. Children rehearsed dances in the dusk. Eleanor wove new shawls for the bride. She dyed them with berries and bark, her hands steady and confident. As she worked, Naley sat beside her, weaving her own thread into the edge. "You are a strong woman," Naley said one evening as they sat beside the loom. "Not because you endured, because you softened without breaking." Eleanor smiled. "I think I broke, but not in the way I feared." "Even the earth cracks," Naley said. "It only lets more light in." When the wedding day arrived, Eleanor walked beside Atza, their steps quiet but sure. The fire was lit in the center of the village, surrounded by smooth stones and prayer bundles. As they placed their offerings beside the flame, Eleanor reached into her shawl and drew out a small carved figure, the bird Atza had once given her, wings outstretched. She set it at the fire's edge and whispered her thanks, not just for being found, but for the strength to stay. As the fire crackled, Atza took her hand. They said no words, but the community saw. And in the way the people nodded, in the way Naley smiled and Cully clapped her hands without understanding why, Eleanor knew. She had been chosen, not because she was young or useful or full of promise, but because she had stayed when others left, loved when it wasn't owed, grown without being asked. That night, Eleanor stood on the ridge where the stars felt closer than breath. Atza joined her, wrapping a fur over her shoulders. Below, the fire still flickered. The village pulsed with laughter and music, but the two of them remained still, watching the world turn. "I used to believe," she whispered, "that I had already lived the best parts of my life, that everything ahead would be survival, quiet endurance. And now?" Atsa asked. She looked at him, then at the vast, wide night. "Now I know the heart has no age, only depth." He nodded, brushing his thumb over the back of her hand. "Sometimes," she continued, "I think the earth watches us. I think it remembers every kindness, every time we choose love when it is hardest." "It does," Atsa said simply. Later that year, Eleanor planted a grove of fruit trees near the edge of the village. Apricot, peach, and a single figure. The children helped her dig. Cully placed stones in a ring around each trunk. Atsa watered them by hand at dawn. By autumn, the first blossoms arrived. Fragile, white, trembling in the breeze. Years passed, and the earth, faithful as always, remembered. Eleanor grew older, but never smaller. Her step slowed, but her presence remained vast. She taught stories by firelight, carved cedar birds with Cully's children, and sang lullabies in a language she never fully learned but understood completely. One morning, a young woman entered her home carrying a newborn. Eleanor took the baby gently, holding her as if the child were made of breath. The woman smiled and said, "She was born during the rain. We named her after you." Eleanor cradled the child and whispered, "You'll never be alone." That night, as Atsa sat beside her near the hearth, Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder and watched the fire dance. "I wonder," she said, "when my time comes, will the wind remember my name?" Atsa kissed the crown of her head. "It already sings it." She closed her eyes, and the fire crackled on. And the land, vast and knowing, did what it always had. It held her story gently, and remembered. The wind came in cold off the prairie, cutting sharper than any knife, and it curled around the empty railroad station like it was looking for someone to haunt. Wooden boards creaked. Rusted metal groaned. And on a half-rotted bench beneath the overhang, Clara Holden sat alone, wrapped in a faded gray shawl that had once belonged to her mother. The wool had thinned with age, but she pulled it tighter all the same, her fingers stiff, chapped, and red from the cold. Her boots, second-hand and ill-fitting, didn't do much to keep out the frost that seeped up from the ground. The hem of her dress, ivory once, now dulled with the dust of travel, trailed through a patch of melting snow, soaking up the wetness like it craved it. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just sat there with her back straight, eyes on the horizon, waiting for something that wouldn't come. The letter in her pocket crackled when the wind shifted. She'd read it enough times to know every word by heart. "Dear Miss Clara Holden, I believe in second chances. I ain't a man with much to offer, but I got a ranch, a roof, and a need for company. If you'd have me, I'd be honored to call you wife. Yours in hope, Everett M. Hollis." Hope. That was the word that had hooked her like a barb in the heart. Hope that maybe, even at 43, she could start again. Hope that she wasn't too late to matter. But the train had long since come and gone. The porter had tipped his hat and gone home. The station master had locked the office and disappeared into the town. And Clara had stayed, too proud to cry and too ashamed to leave. She had told herself she'd wait one more hour. Then another. And another. Now the sky had turned the color of bruised lavender. Night was crawling over the land like a slow, bitter tide. And she was still there, waiting. Hoofbeats. She blinked, sat straighter, and turned her head. A horse and rider came over the rise, not at a gallop, but a slow, steady trot. The man in the saddle wore a wide-brimmed hat and a coat dusted with trail dirt. He rode like someone who knew both hardship and rhythm, like he'd been born on a horse and never quite came off. His face came into view as he drew closer, square-jawed, weathered, eyes shaded but alert. Clara didn't know him, and he didn't look like a man searching for a bride. He reined in beside the platform, his horse snorting as it pawed the ground. "You waiting for someone?" he asked, voice deep, worn smooth by wind and silence. Clara hesitated, then nodded just once. "Train already came," he said. "I know." His eyes flicked over her dress, her shawl, the small satchel at her feet. "They late?" "Not anymore," she said softly. "Just not coming." He dismounted, not in a hurry, but with the calm of a man who didn't like to leave things untended. He tied off his horse, walked up the 2 wooden steps, and stood just far enough to be polite, close enough to be curious. "I'm Caleb Rowe," he said. "Came to pick up supplies. Feed store, left my order by the station door." He jerked a thumb toward the sacks stacked near the wall. "Didn't expect company." Clara offered a thin smile. "Didn't expect to be company." He studied her a moment longer, then reached into his coat and pulled out a tin flask. "Coffee," he said, unscrewing the top. "Hot." "Just barely." "Want some?" She hesitated, then nodded. He handed it to her, without ceremony. She sipped. It was strong and bitter and beautiful. She almost wept. "You're not from around here," he said, more a statement than a question. "No." "Let me guess. Came all this way to marry a man you never met." She stiffened, fingers tightening around the tin. "Is that so obvious?" He shrugged. "Only folks who wait at the station these days are runaways, drunks, or hearts too hopeful for their own good. You don't smell like whiskey, and you ain't running." She laughed, a brittle sound that caught her off guard. "Then I suppose I'm the third kind." He glanced at her dress again. "He left you here?" "No note. No word. Nothing." "That's low," he said. Clara stared out at the darkening horizon. "I should leave. Go back east. Or somewhere. But I don't have the money. Not anymore. I gave everything to get here." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "You got family?" "Dead. Or distant enough it's the same thing." "You got anywhere to sleep tonight?" Clara shook her head slowly. He looked toward his wagon, then back at her. "Listen," he said, voice slower now, careful. "I lost my wife 3 years ago. Got 2 kids. Farms holding together with twine and prayer. I didn't come looking for a wife. Hell, I wasn't even looking for company. But I can't just leave you here." She met his eyes for the first time. "I'm not charity," she said. He nodded. "Didn't say you were." "I don't want pity." "Then don't take it," he replied. "Take the seat. I'll get you warm food and a roof for the night. After that, we figure things out." She looked down at the tin flask, then back at him. "You sure?" "No," he said, almost smiling. "But it's too damn cold to think straight." She rose slowly, wincing as her knees cracked. He took her satchel. She allowed him, just barely. They walked to his wagon in silence. But at the last step, she paused. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He didn't look at her, just tightened the reins. "Because no one should be left behind at a place like this," he said. Then, after a breath, almost like it surprised even him, "And maybe I just didn't want to be the kind of man who rides past anymore." As the wagon pulled away from the station, the wind howled behind them, but Clara didn't look back. The letter in her pocket felt lighter somehow, like a burden finally loosened. She didn't know where the road led now, but for the first time in days, she wasn't alone on it. The town of Dust Hollow wasn't the sort of place you stumbled upon. It sat nestled between 2 worn hills, surrounded by fields that had once grown wheat, but now hosted more dust than grain. The wind carried the taste of iron and old earth, and the church bell sounded more like a sigh than a call. Everybody knew everybody, and if they didn't, they made sure to find out before sundown. Clara Holden felt the weight of eyes before the wagon even reached the main street. Caleb Rowe, sitting beside her with the reins in hand, said nothing, but she could see the way his jaw tightened. Not at her, but at the knowing that came with rolling back into town with a woman folks didn't expect. At the general store, 2 men paused in stacking barrels. One nudged the other. Whispered words didn't need to reach Clara's ears for her to understand. She kept her eyes on her lap, hands folded too tightly, while the wagon creaked along. The children saw them next. A group of schoolboys playing marbles outside the teacher's house stopped mid-turn, watching with slack mouths and wide eyes. A freckled girl dropped her slate board and whispered, "Is that the bride?" The church steeple loomed overhead as they passed. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Cantrell, looked out from her front window, lips moving like they were already forming prayer or judgment. Sometimes the two were hard to tell apart. When they reached Caleb's homestead, Clara saw it for the first time in full light. A square, low-slung house made from river stone and timber, roof patched in places, but sturdy. A fenced yard, 2 goats, a henhouse leaning slightly to one side, and beyond it, acres of brown earth waiting for spring. There was a narrow porch with 2 chairs and a windshield made from spoons. It was not grand, but it was honest. 2 children stood on the porch steps. The boy was slight, perhaps 8 or 9, with hair like Caleb's and a quick, curious expression. The girl, older, 13 maybe, crossed her arms over her chest and glared like Clara had arrived with shackles instead of a satchel. Caleb nodded toward them. "That's Emma," he said. "And the boy's Jonas." Clara offered a hesitant smile. Jonas gave a little wave, unsure. Emma turned and walked into the house without a word. That evening, Clara sat at the table and tried to eat stew that tasted like sage and smoke. Caleb spoke little, mostly to the children, though he looked to Clara often, eyes checking in, offering her a tether. Jonas asked her where she was from. She said, Illinois. He asked her if she'd ever seen a riverboat. She smiled and said, "Once when I was your age." Emma didn't speak at all. After the meal, Clara helped clear the table. She didn't know where anything belonged, and her hands fumbled with the dishes. Caleb leaned beside the sink and showed her how to pump the water. His shoulder brushed hers. It felt accidental, but not unwelcome. Later, in the room Caleb's late wife had once used for sewing, Clara sat on the edge of a narrow bed, unpinning her hair. The house creaked with old wood and memories. From the other side of the wall, she heard Emma's voice, angry and sharp. "She doesn't belong here. Mama's only been gone 3 years." And Caleb's reply, soft but firm, "Nobody's trying to replace your mama, Em. But no one's replacing your heart either." That night, Clara didn't sleep. She watched moonlight crawl across the window pane and felt like a stranger in her own skin. In town, word spread faster than fire on dry grass. By the time Clara returned with Caleb to the general store the next morning, people didn't bother whispering anymore. Mrs. Cantrell approached her directly, hands folded as if in mourning. "Mrs. Rowe," she said, drawing out the words, "you must understand folks are just surprised is all. A woman your age, coming from nowhere. It's brave, truly." Clara forced a smile. "Well, I was told Dust Hollow could use more bravery." Mrs. Cantrell stiffened. "Indeed. And discretion." Caleb returned with the supplies, didn't comment. But his hand found Clara's as they walked out the door. Over the next week, Clara tried to find her place. She swept the porch, even when the wind undid her work. She mended a ripped curtain in the parlor, burned the first 2 loaves of bread, then got the third just right. She brought eggs to the neighbor's wife across the creek, only to find they'd already been given by Emma. Clara tried to give the girl space, but space felt like a canyon some days. Jonas followed her like a shadow. He helped her in the garden when the frost finally lifted, asked questions about what life was like in the East. She told him stories, not grand ones, just small things. He laughed when she mentioned she once fell into a pond chasing a goose. His laughter made the house feel warmer. One afternoon, Clara tried to fix a splintered fence board herself. She held the hammer wrong and ended up striking her thumb so hard she saw stars. Emma watched from the porch. "You don't have to pretend," the girl said. Clara looked up, cradling her hand. "Pretend what?" "That you're one of us." Clara sat on the grass, holding back the tears, threatening her composure. "I don't know how to be anything but myself." Emma's gaze faltered, but she didn't answer. She turned and walked inside, slamming the screen door behind her. Later, Clara sat at the kitchen table, thumb wrapped in a rag, when Caleb entered. "She's got my wife's fire," he said, sitting across from her. "I'm not trying to replace that," Clara replied. "I'm just trying not to get burned." He gave her a long look, then reached across the table and took her hand. "I didn't bring you here to make everything perfect. I brought you here because you didn't flinch. Not once. Not even when everyone else turned their back." Clara blinked hard. "You barely know me. Maybe. But I know enough. Enough to want to give this a chance." The next morning, Clara rose early and started on breakfast before the rest were awake. She fried potatoes, made biscuits from a recipe half remembered, and sliced apples with cinnamon. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm and made with intention. Emma took one bite, then pushed her plate back. "I'm not hungry," she said. Caleb frowned, but Clara held up a hand. "That's all right. Everyone eats when they're ready." Jonas said through a full mouth, "This is real good." That afternoon, while Caleb rode into town to meet with the farrier, Clara tried to hang laundry on the line. A gust of wind took one of Caleb's shirts and sent it flying into the pasture. She cursed under her breath, grabbed the hem of her skirt, and took off after it. Emma watched from the porch again, arms crossed. She said nothing until Clara returned, breathless, shirt in hand. "You look ridiculous running like that," the girl said. Clara looked at her, deadpan. Well, better ridiculous than shirtless. The silence that followed was short, and broken by a small, reluctant snort from Emma. Clara smiled. Progress. Maybe. That evening, Caleb came back from town with a hardened expression. "They were talking about you," he said. "Again. Said you conned me. Called you a charity bride." Clara nodded slowly. "I expected worse." "I didn't." "They're just scared of what they don't understand," Clara said, turning back to her stitching. "A woman who doesn't fit their mold. A man who doesn't need their approval. They don't know your worth." "No," she said softly. "But you're starting to." That night, Emma didn't slam the door. The next morning, Clara found a small note on her pillow, written in careful, crooked handwriting. "Thank you for not leaving. Emma." Clara folded it, tucked it into her pocket, and pressed her hand to her chest. She stepped outside, and for the first time since she arrived, she breathed in the prairie wind and smiled. She would not run. Not from this. Not now. The snow came in sudden, like it had been waiting just past the edge of a sky for the right moment to fall. It powdered the hills and blurred the distance, quieted the chickens, and silenced even the wind chimes on the row porch. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the white wash over the land like a sheet pulled tight. She held a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands. Caleb's voice came from behind her. Storm wasn't supposed to hit till tomorrow. "It's early," Clara murmured. He set down a crate of firewood beside the stove and stretched his back, shoulders groaning with age and wear. That's the thing about Dust Hollow. Nothing ever comes right on time. Not storms. Not good fortune. Not even people. Clara looked at him, one brow raised. He smiled faintly. "Except you." Her lips parted, surprised. But before she could respond, a loud slam echoed from the front door. Emma's boots stomped across the wooden floor, her cheeks pink with cold and frustration. "They were laughing at me," she snapped. "At school. Said Pa bought himself a used wife from the East." Clara's heart sank, but she didn't flinch. "And what did you say back?" "I didn't say anything. I walked out." "You walked home? In this?" Emma didn't answer. Caleb rubbed a hand down his face. "They'll keep talking, Em. That's what people do." "It's not just them," Emma said, suddenly trembling. "It's everyone. I keep hearing Mama's name like a ghost whispering. Every time I look at her chair, it's like I'm betraying her." Clara said nothing. The silence stretched long. Then, slowly, she walked over, kneeled before Emma, and spoke gently. "You're not betraying her. You're grieving her. And that takes longer than anyone says." Emma's mouth quivered. "She used to braid my hair before school." Clara reached out. "Then maybe I can learn to do it the same way. Not to replace her, just to remember her." But Emma jerked back, turned, and stomped off to her room. That night, the wind howled so loud it sounded like voices arguing just beyond the window glass. Caleb sat near the fire, whittling a piece of cedar into a horse for Jonas. Clara sat beside him, darning a torn mitten. "Don't take it personal," he said after a while. "I don't," she replied, even though she did. "She's scared," he added. "So scared she's turning her pain into claws." "I know," Clara said. "I just hope she doesn't cut too deep before she learns where to lay them down." The next morning, Emma was gone. Her bed untouched, her boots missing, her winter coat taken. A note lay on the kitchen table in shaky handwriting. "I need to think." Don't come after me. Jonas cried when he read it. Caleb cursed once under his breath, then saddled his horse so fast Clara barely had time to grab her shawl. I'm going with you, she said. No. You stay. In case she comes back. Clara shook her head. I know that girl. She's hurt, not foolish. She didn't run off to hide. She ran off to feel something stronger than grief. Caleb hesitated, but then nodded. We head east, toward the creek. They searched for hours, the snow growing deeper by the minute. Clara's fingers went numb. Her nose stung with cold. They found nothing, no prints, no trail. Until just past the old mining road, Clara spotted something near a bent tree, a scrap of blue fabric snagged on a branch. Here, she called out, scrambling down the slope. They followed the path, weaving through thickets, until they reached a creek half-frozen, the water a ribbon of silver beneath the ice. Emma sat at the bank, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around herself. Her coat was damp, her cheeks white, her lips trembling. Clara ran forward, knelt, and pulled her close. I'm sorry, Emma said. I thought maybe if I sat where Mama used to take us, I'd feel her again. But all I felt was cold. You should have told us where you were going, Caleb said, kneeling beside them. We were scared. Emma sniffled. I thought you'd be better off without me. Caleb caught her chin, gently. Don't you ever think that. They got her on the horse, wrapped in Caleb's coat. Clara rode behind her, arms locked tight around the girl's shivering body, whispering soft things that had no shape but held weight. When they got home, Clara built the fire higher, rubbed warmth back into Emma's hands, brewed tea with honey and mint. Later, when the girl finally slept, Caleb pulled Clara into the kitchen. I thought I lost her, he said, voice raw. And if I had, I don't know if I'd have known how to breathe again. Clara nodded, eyes wet. She's still here. And she came back with more than just frostbite. She came back with a beginning. The snow kept falling through the night. They didn't sleep. Around dawn, they heard the frantic knock on the door. It was Elias Moore, a neighbor half a mile off. His barn was ablaze, flames licking up the walls, his livestock in danger, his sons too small to help. Caleb was up and out the door before the man had finished his sentence. Clara grabbed coats, boots, water buckets. Emma stirred, eyes wide. I want to help, she said. Clara looked at her, truly looked, and saw the fear in her, but also the will to face it. They rode hard through the snow. The barn was a bright orange wound against the pale world, smoke-black as sin. Caleb and Elias ran for the well, shouting orders. Clara took buckets, formed a chain with the others. Emma followed, dragging heavy pails, slipping and rising again. The heat was intense. Sparks kissed Clara's hair and tried to eat her skirt. A horse screamed inside, and Elias cursed, turning to run back in. You'll die in there, Caleb yelled, grabbing him. I ain't letting that mare burn. Clara didn't think. She grabbed her shawl, drenched it in snow, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She ran into the fire. Smoke clawed at her lungs. Flames danced like angry spirits. She found the mare kicking in her stall, eyes wild. It's all right, she whispered, soothing, though her heart thundered. You're not alone. She unlatched the gate, tugged the rope, and stumbled back as the horse bolted into the snow. She barely made it out. Hands pulled her from the smoke. Caleb, his face stricken, his voice shaking. You fool, he said. You could have. I didn't. Later, when the fire was finally out and only steaming wreckage remained, Emma came to her, arms full of a blanket. You were brave, she said quietly. Clara laughed, winced. No, just too stubborn to die. Emma wrapped the blanket around her and whispered, I'm glad you didn't. When they returned home, Clara stood in front of the mirror, tracing the singe marks on her shawl, the soot on her skin. She looked older, fiercer, real. Caleb came up behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder. You saved her twice, he said. Clara met his eyes in the glass. She saved me, too. Gave me someone to fight for. That night, they all sat around the hearth, silent but warm. Jonas fell asleep on the rug. Emma leaned into Clara's side without a word. Caleb played with his carving knife, But his eyes never left Clara's face. The fire crackled. The snow slowed. Outside, the world was still cold. But inside, something had started to thaw. The frost clung thick to the windows, painting each pane in quiet white lace as dawn broke over Dust Hollow. A silence lay across the land, not peace, but tension, the kind that settles in before something breaks. Clara Holden stirred the fire with slow, measured strokes, her hands rough from work and still faintly scarred from the barn blaze days ago. Her shawl was wrapped tight, but it wasn't the cold that made her feel the chill this morning. Caleb stood at the table, staring down at a piece of paper crumpled in his fist. His jaw was tight, his shoulders square with a tension that didn't come from farm work. "They're coming," he said. Clara turned. "Who?" "Harvey Black's boys. From over the ridge." The name dropped like a stone into still water. Harvey Black had once owned the neighboring property before his gambling debts, and a slow season had forced him to sell it off in pieces. Caleb had bought the land cheap, fair, and legal, but word was Harvey had never forgiven him. Now the old man was gone, but his sons, meaner than he ever was, had come to collect something that wasn't theirs. He sent word. Clara asked. Caleb shook his head, more like warning. Elias passed the message along. They planned to ride in by sundown. Clara set the poker down carefully. What do they want? To scare us off. Burn what's left. Maybe worse. She crossed to him and took the paper from his hands. It wasn't a letter, just a rough sketch, a drawing of their homestead with a red X across it. Crude, childish, menace wrapped in charcoal lines. It trembled slightly in her grip. "Can we fight them?" she asked. Caleb hesitated. "I'll try. I've got my rifle. Elias and a few others'll stand with us if it comes to that." "And if it does?" He looked her in the eye. "We don't run." Emma stood in the doorway, thin as a reed but with fire in her eyes. "Then neither do I." By noon, the sky had turned the color of tin. The snow had stopped falling, but what lay on the ground was enough to muffle steps, enough to leave no mistake if blood spilled. Clara worked fast, packing what needed hiding, feeding the fire, boiling water, filling lanterns. She cleaned Caleb's rifle like he'd shown her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. Emma helped gather tools that could serve as weapons. Axes, pitchforks, anything with a point or weight. Jonas, confused but obedient, stayed inside. He didn't ask many questions. Clara braided his hair and told him stories as the hours passed, even though her voice cracked around the edges. When she finished, he leaned into her side and whispered, "I don't want you to get hurt." "I don't want to either," she said. "But I will if it means keeping you safe." By the time the sun began to slip behind the hills, the air felt sharper. The fire popped like it knew something was coming. Caleb stood on the porch with his rifle slung low, a shadow stretching behind him. Clara joined him. "They'll expect weakness," he said. "Then we give them surprise." Emma came out next, holding her mother's old locket. She handed it to Clara. "You should wear this. If something happens, I want her close to someone who'd fight." Clara slipped it over her head, fingers trembling. "Thank you." They heard the hooves first, slow, heavy, deliberate. 4 riders, all tall, broad, wrapped in coats like wolves in sheep's wool. The lead man had a scar that split his cheek like a crack in dry earth. He pulled up just beyond the gate and smiled. "Evening," he said, like they were neighbors trading pie. Caleb stepped forward, calm but unreadable. "This land's mine. Used to be ours. Bought out when our old man was too deep in the bottle to see straight. You sold it fair." The scarred man's smile twisted. "Fair's a matter of who holds a gun." Another rider stepped forward, pulled a pistol from his belt, and leveled it casually at the ground. "We ain't here to argue. Just came to tell you it's time to pack up. We'll be back tomorrow, and anything left standing burns." Clara stepped forward. The men noticed her, surprised. She didn't look like a threat, just a woman in a worn dress and a shawl with soot-stained edges. But her voice was steel. "If you come back," she said, "you better bring more than 4 men. You'll find this house a lot harder to tear down than you think." The scarred man laughed. "What's this? The charity wife finds her tongue." Clara met his eyes without blinking. I may have been left before, but I wasn't broken. And I damn sure won't be scared off by men who can't build anything of their own. He raised his pistol slowly, mockingly. Caleb took a step forward, rifle half raised. But Elias appeared then from behind the barn, shotgun at the ready. Behind him, 3 more townsmen followed, one with a pitchfork, another with a lasso, and the last with a worn saber from an old war. The lead man looked around, taking in the numbers. Caleb said, quiet but firm, "Dust Hollow remembers its own." "You didn't count on that, did you?" Scarface clicked his tongue, then spit into the snow. "We'll see how long memory holds." He turned, gestured, and the riders wheeled away into the growing dark. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her knees felt weak, but she stayed upright. That night, the house felt warmer than it ever had. Emma came to Clara after dinner, carrying a small, carved bird Jonas had made. "He wants you to have it. Said you're part of the flock now." Clara took it, tears welling. "I thought family had to come with blood," Emma said. "But I was wrong." Clara pulled her into a hug, heart aching with a joy too fragile to hold fully. Outside, Caleb chopped more firewood. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. Clara watched him through the window, then stepped out onto the porch. "You didn't have to let me stay," she said. He turned. "You didn't have to marry me. I didn't do it for shelter." "I know." There was a pause. Then he stepped forward, close. "I fell in love with you the moment you didn't flinch," he said. "And then again every day after." She reached up, touched his face. "Then let's not waste what we've started," she whispered. He kissed her, soft, unhurried, like a man claiming not possession, but promise. The next morning, the frost was thick again, but the fire inside the hearth roared steady. Clara made breakfast while the kids laughed in the other room. Caleb came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and pressed his forehead to her neck. The locket still hung from her throat. The carved bird sat on the windowsill. Outside, smoke curled gently from the chimney, rising into a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Somewhere down the road, the black boys would nurse their wounded pride and likely never come back. But it didn't matter. They'd already lost the one thing they didn't understand. A woman who'd been abandoned, who'd been judged too late and too plain, had stood, fought, and stayed. And in that staying, had lit a fire in a house that once held only silence. A fire no frost could put out.